Good morning and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. And my guest today, I'm very happy to say, is veteran boxing writer and author of a couple of good books about Ezra Charles and Matthew Saad Muhammad. And one of the people who actually got me into my short stint writing professionally at the Ring is Bill Dettloff. Good morning, Bill. And I'm going to assume most of my viewers are not heavy boxing fans. So go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit.
Thanks, Chris. First, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
My pleasure.
With you. So I've been a boxing writer for 175 years, or maybe I'm exaggerating, 100, maybe 110 years. No, for most of my adult life, I've been writing and covering boxing and boxers. I fought as an amateur. I'm using the word fought advisedly in this context throughout my teenage years and once in my late 20s. And when I finally discovered that I would never be any real threat to anybody in a boxing ring, I switched to writing and found out through some accident of the universe that I could write much better than I could fight. So I've been doing that for most of my adult life. And it's a pleasure to be here with you, Chris.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you here. I wish I could say I've been writing most of my adult life. I came into legacy media at the absolute worst time in history to come into legacy media. And it's only gotten worse for legacy media since then. I saw that your last podcast appearance was saying that your boxing magazine is folding.
Yes, that's true.
And I was like, wow, that was the only one left.
Well, it was at the time, it was the last print boxing magazine in the U.S. But since then, as you may have heard, The Ring, which is the oldest U.S. Boxing magazine, they had canceled their print version where we're strictly online.
Yes.
But then they were bought by our friends in Saudi Arabia.
I'm curious. I have to ask a question now.
Sure.
And if you don't know, that's cool. Is this another Emerson Collective venture with Steve Jobs' widow?
No.
At the Atlantic?
No, it's not.
Okay. I always try to keep an eye on what they're doing because they scare me.
Well, it's interesting. They came into it with the same cautions that Golden Boy did when Golden Boy Promotions bought the Ring, in that they won't have any influence editorially.
Everybody says that.
Yeah, exactly right. And here's the catch also is, and even if they don't, nobody will believe them anyway, right? Anytime something editorial is done in favor of one of their fighters, people will say it's because of them, right?
Even if they're genuinely hands off, that still won't change the fact that the editing staff will start quietly editing themselves in order to conform to the ownership to at least a certain point.
Right.
Because you have to do that in your mind to keep your job at some point.
Exactly right.
This is why, this is why a lot of people weren't trashing Oscar De La Hoya on the internet after he fired them, because, you still potentially may need to write at some point, and how many places are there to publish you?
Well, that's the other thing is that the markets are getting smaller and smaller, and the point I was going to make is now that my magazine, Ringside Seat, was the last print boxing magazine in the U.S., and now the Ring, since the acquisition by our friends in Saudi Arabia, they're restarting the print edition. So, so there'll be a print edition of the Ring, which is kind of cool. Again, as long as you're not totally turned off by who the owners of the Ring are now.
I mean, how at some point, if I were going to completely ignore media because I was totally turned off by who the owners are, what would I even consume?
Exactly right. Nothing. You wouldn't consume anything.
I mean, the LA Times is owned by one of the worst billionaires in the country. It's just a shame that more people don't know who he is and how bad he is. The Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos. And both of them recently broke their hands-off promise. And I was not endorsing Kamala Harris myself. I was telling people, look, if you really care about anything and you really want to see some difference, I know it's scary, but this really is the best election in history to vote third party. and people didn't do it once again. But no, you go ahead.
Well, I was one of those people who once again didn't do it because
yeah, of course.
It's got to be this can't be by accident that this keeps happening, right?
Yeah.
It's the most important election of our lifetime, and we don't want this awful guy
Yeah,
in.
But that's the thing. Yeah, no, because I'm with you there. I've been seeing the most important election of our lifetime from Democrats for all my life.
Exactly right. It's interesting. I watch this TV show is before your time, I'm sure, Chris, but I'm sure you've heard of or seen occasionally All in the Family.
Oh yeah, no,
right?
It's before my time, but I'm also, you have to remember, I'm a Gen Xer at the last tail end, so I'm a child of the 80s, and I'm from the age of reruns.
Okay, good, me too. So I recently saw an episode in which, get this, Meathead and Archie were arguing about politics.
Of course.
Right? Exactly. And Mike says to Archie, this is the most important election of our lifetime, and we have to choose between saving our democracy and devolving into fascism. And this episode was about one of the Nixon elections. Okay, so that's how long we've been hearing that. And
now here's the joke.
So something's wrong there, right?
Now here's the joke. At the same time, because this is 1972, this is one of my favorite watershed history moments. At the same time that Meathead is telling Archie, we have to beat fascism, this is the year that Joe Biden ran against Cale Boggs in Delaware. Cale Boggs was a liberal Republican who had supported the 64 and 68 Civil Rights Acts, had co-sponsored the 68 Civil Rights Act with a couple of other Republicans and Hubert Humphrey, and he was a big deal. So this is like, and Joe Biden is the guy who resegregates schools in his first year in the Senate, running against this liberal Republican who had done all this good stuff by the standards of the 1960s.
Right.
He's not the only one. A few years later, a guy named Paul Tsongas runs in Massachusetts against Edward Brooke. Edward Brooke is the guy who wrote the Fair Housing Act and the 1968 Civil Rights Act. He was the other Republican co-sponsor. He was the most liberal senator in the Senate, regardless of party. And this son of Greek immigrants runs against him from this I'm a working class white guy, don't forget about me platform, like Republicans use now, and gets rid of the first black senator since Reconstruction. And worst of all, you'll recognize this name, a Middlesex County prosecutor named John Kerry opens a criminal investigation into Edward Brooke's divorce for no other purpose than to help Tsongas out during the election.
Wow.
Now, imagine a criminal investigation being opened into a politician's divorce today. Can you see that happening?
No.
And this was, we'll just do this to get better results in the election.
Right.
And it's, well, that's normal political dirty tricks. Democrats help Democrats. Sure, yeah. But this is the guy who later would say, I'm the liberal choice, and who was a liberal icon for talking up against the Vietnam War.
Right.
Helping a really conservative Democrat beat the most liberal guy in the Senate and essentially help drag the country right. And this started in 1972 with Joe Biden running against Cale Boggs, and all the other Reagan Democrats came in the next few years. And that's like, we don't realize how much our politics changed in 1972.
Yeah.
We think, oh, McGovern lost, and that's the end of it. But even before McGovern lost, we saddled him with Tom Eagleton at the convention, who's the guy who gave Nixon the acid amnesty and abortion line. He actually said that to a reporter himself on the convention floor the night before he was chosen as running mate. He said, the only thing anybody knows about McGovern is he's for he's for abortion, acid, and amnesty.
Wow.
And that was Nixon's line in the commercial.
Yeah.
Eagleton said it. Eagleton handed it to Nixon, like wrapped in a bow on the floor of the convention to a reporter. And then he's the running mate. And then McGovern's loyal to him at first when the news of his mental health issues and electric shock therapy come out. And I'm going to stand by Eagleton. And it's like, dude, why? And then when he finally does dump him, he does it at a point when he looks bad because he said he's going to stand by him.
Right, right.
You should have never let them saddle you with that guy in the first place. And it has nothing to do with his mental health.
Right.
But, I mean, that's the Democratic Party, though. That's why I couldn't even – that's why it's like, you know, we can either vote third party or stay home. I would encourage people this time to vote third party instead of staying home because, you know, the more people actually vote third party, the more it will send a message to whoever does win. But, of course, instead what we got was a massive amount of staying home where Kamala Harris had 12 to 15 million votes fewer than Joe Biden in 2020, and Donald Trump had 3 to 5 million votes fewer than he did when he lost in 2020 because of all the people on both sides who stayed home.
Yeah.
That's the real story of the election is all those people who stayed home and didn't vote for Kamala Harris.
Yeah, I agree. I've voted for third party a couple times. I have in the past and will continue if he ever runs again, voted for Bernie Sanders. But I'm apparently almost all alone in that because Bernie Sanders just can't win a national election, apparently.
Well, what's real? Well, it's not that Bernie Sanders can't win a national election. It's that Bernie Sanders cannot get past the nomination of the nominating process of the Democratic Party, which is a whole different process. I had I don't want to say pleasure because it ended up in the main being a very disheartening and negative experience. I had the experience of working with a lot of people who really admired Bernie Sanders who were running for Congress in 2020 as a volunteer online. Lots of great people. Some great people here in Oregon, people in Washington, people in Massachusetts, people in Missouri, Colorado, all over the place. Texas, there are some great people in Texas. There are still some great people in New Jersey fighting against the most corrupt Democratic Party in the country. But it was a tremendously negative experience. The biggest reason was because the people you would expect to support all these progressive, we're running to support Bernie Sanders candidates, people like Bernie Sanders and Ro Khanna, were really lining up to support their more moderate primary opponents to show that they were on the same page as the Democratic Party. They didn't want to make anybody angry the way they made people angry in 2016.
I see.
And it was really very disappointing in that you could sort of get the feeling, and early on I was like, we're going to win this time. They couldn't force their guy through the DNC chair without compromises. There are too many people who have seats on the DNC who are running for president themselves. They're not going to screw Bernie if it means screwing themselves. And all these other thoughts that were going through my head. And I really believed that people like Cory Booker cared about issues like legal pot as much as they said. And that people like Julian Castro cared about an open border as much as they said. And so naturally they would endorse the only candidate who was also for those things when the time came. And that ended up not being the case, of course. And so we'll never really know whether Bernie Sanders can win a national election because the Democrats will never give him a chance. And in 2020, when he threw his own supporter, Zephyr Teachout, under the bus for writing a Guardian article talking about Joe's history of corruption, and he said, no, this is beyond the pale. I can't associate myself with this. And it's like, Bernie, what are you doing? This is why you should be winning. He is not your good friend Joe, no matter how many times you try to tell us that.
Right.
But, it is what it is. And Bernie wasn't going to be Ralph Nader. He's determined not to be Ralph Nader at any cost.
I voted for Ralph Nader also, by the way.
Well, as you should have.
Yeah, exactly right.
As everybody should have. I
don't know why anybody wouldn't. Why wouldn't you?
Well, and that's really the thing, though, is that was once again, you had, and it's always the same people. And I name these people because some of them still follow me on Twitter, even though they're not active. Norman Solomon comes to mind. Other people in what you would call the old left, which used to be the new left in the 70s.
Right.
And are just, on the one hand, really believe in a lot of this Marxist stuff and class warfare and the revolutionary ideas, but on the other hand, are so committed to this idea of the politics of the possible that they just bitch out to the worst people in the Democratic Party and think that compromising with the most conservative people in the Democratic Party is going to make the Democratic Party more progressive. Whereas the most conservative people in the Democratic Party have been waiting to embrace George W. Bush since 2000 and finally got their chance in 2024. And he still wouldn't endorse them. I never thought I would see a Democratic presidential candidate chasing W's endorsement and not get it like that.
Yeah.
I still don't know what to think about that.
Well, can you? Right.
It's just like, that's how they're already trying to rehabilitate Trump. There are already Democrats having private meetings with Trump about how they can work together, which they wanted to do in 2020, even though they wouldn't come out and say it. That was when they had Amy McGrath in Kentucky running for Senate, saying she was telling people in Kentucky, I'll work more closely with Trump than Mitch McConnell if you elect me. And thought that more support for Trump would help Democrats win Kentucky. Crazy world. But it's changed so much. The Democrats still pretended to be liberal when I was a kid. You would hear Democrats talk about healthcare the way Bernie Sanders tries to now.
Well, when we were kids, the Republicans are more liberal than Democrats are now, right?
Yes. Even Ronald Reagan told Menachem Begin, please stop bombing Lebanon.
Yeah. If you look at the Republican platform in the late 60s and early 70s, it was more liberal than the Democratic platform today.
Well, I mean, heck, the last reform in healthcare that actually helped people happened under Richard Nixon. And that was the HMO and PPO Act, which was supposed to establish the basic framework for universal health care without a fully socialized system. The idea was everybody would either fit into Medicaid, Medicare, or have an HMO or PPO. The idea being, because when Nixon was president, both parties still, in theory, believed in this idea, that the goal was full employment. And with full employment, everybody would have insurance through their work. Now, full employment was abandoned by both parties in the 1990s. And that changed everything right there. It's only gotten worse since then, and attempts to save it have still shackled it to people's jobs, whether it was COBRA, which only helped you if you were willing to pay out of pocket to keep the plan you used to get almost for free at your old job.
Right.
And the Affordable Care Act, which again ultimately was designed to force employers to provide better insurance to bail out insurance companies rather than to actually help the end user of healthcare. And it is just, both of those attempts to just sort of like paper over the fact that Nixon never socialized medicine just didn't work, because the problem was his Medicare and Medicaid never kept up with inflation the way that it was assumed they were going to. And we never kept working for full employment the way it was assumed we were going to, which was the whole point of Nixon's price and wage controls, to try to force employers to keep going for full employment. But, everything's changed since Nixon, and not for the better, which is the scariest thing. I think when people saw Nixon go, it was like, it's going to get better now. That's the impression I get anyway, looking back. I know that was what I thought when Reagan was gone. It's going to get better now.
Right. It did not.
It did not. It didn't even get that much better when W was gone. And I swear I should have known it when Biden became the running mate, because Biden and Pelosi were in on all of the lying to Congress, which I don't think Obama knew when he was running for president and saying, we're going to get the people who lied us into war. And I really think after he won, Biden sat him down and said, since I'm going to be your vice president, you should really know that Nancy Pelosi and I lied us into war too. And if you go after everybody, you'll have to go after us. It'll be just as bad for the Democrats as the Republicans.
Makes sense.
And then that's when John Brennan went from being public enemy number one to Obama's new best friend. And that laid the groundwork for Trump, because now of a sudden Obama is embracing all the war criminals he said he was going to get. And Trump is able to say, well, what did Jeb Bush do? His brother got us into a stupid war. And people just don't underestimate the romantic value of being able to project everything onto somebody who doesn't believe anything himself.
Sure. Agreed.
And I'm talking too much. I need to let you talk.
It's okay. It's your show.
Yeah, but I'm supposed to be listening to you. But no, so you had mentioned that you had wanted to talk about healthcare specifically.
Yeah.
Too.
Well, what's interesting to me about healthcare and the disaster that it is in this country is that I know people for whom healthcare and health insurance and rising costs is the number one issue for them politically, but would rather stick pins in their eyes than vote for Bernie Sanders, the only politician who has been talking about healthcare and the need for universal healthcare for 40 years. And so there's a disconnect there that essentially is an impediment to anything ever going forward with that. If you cannot, because of his other stances and other positions, because he's too much of a socialist, if you can't vote for the only guy for whom health insurance or healthcare coverage is a major issue, then nothing's ever going to get fixed. You have to support the people who support your issues, right? So I just think that we've been conditioned in this country for so long and so skillfully to believe that it has to be this way, that we can't accept that that we can have that here under a democratic socialist umbrella, that it just can't happen if the only way for it to happen is to vote for a socialist, right? So I don't see any path forward for any kind of improvement in our healthcare system.
I see paths forward, but none of those paths are easy or fun or pleasant paths. One of the things that I really think of right now that somebody with the desktop publishing skills should really latch on to is you get a nice picture of Winnie Mandela and Nelson Mandela at their wedding. And underneath it, you put the tagline, ask this woman what she did to stay busy while her husband was in prison.
Which was?
Well, so that while Nelson Mandela was in prison, the ANC had a policy where if cops in a specific neighborhood shot someone, their police station got blown up. If a judge in a specific jurisdiction egregiously broke the law in order to do something discriminatory, he got assassinated. Now, I'm not endorsing violence, but what did JFK say? People who make nonviolent revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. And we're seeing this with whether you believe there's a couple of interesting pictures. And the guy in the pictures who killed the United Healthcare executive didn't look like he had a unibrow. And the guy they caught looks like he kind of has a unibrow. And there's open questions about whether they got the right guy if you really want to ask them. But even if they got the right guy, you notice that somebody shot a healthcare executive, and none of the ordinary people are really pissed about it. All of the people who are trying to morally chide the public on this are people with nice, safe, secure media jobs who are worried about being seen to endorse political violence and therefore losing their jobs.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. I've caught a little heat on social media for celebrating this, or at the very least not condemning it. And I don't see how anybody cannot keep from at least being not outraged by it. Okay. Yeah. I don't understand it at all, because I think we're past the point where any of this should be condemned. If you have nothing else to do, like you just said, like JFK said, if you're powerless, and that's the only method you have toward any kind of reparation, then what are you supposed to do? So I guess I'll get some more heat for saying this, but this guy's going to turn out to be a folk hero.
Yes.
If what he did results in any kind of changes that benefit the greater good.
Even if it doesn't necessarily result in change, he's still going to end up becoming a folk hero. The story that always comes into my mind is one from rural Alabama, a tale of the Jim Crow South, called The Story of Railroad Bill. Now, Railroad Bill was a black hobo who probably escaped from a chain gang in rural Louisiana in the 1870s. And he hopped on trains, and not to rob the trains, but just, to take a free ride on a train, like as hobos have always been wont to do. Only, of course, this was the Jim Crow South. So, a black hobo couldn't hitch a ride on a white train without running into cops. Sure. Railroad Bill got into gunfights with the cops over sleeping on trains. Not trying to rob trains, but just got into gunfights with the cops because he wanted to sleep on trains and ride for free. And he was a huge folk hero in rural Alabama for many, many, many years, at least until the end of segregation, because he was getting into gunfights with the cops to stand up for his right to ride the train for free.
Sure.
A right that didn't really exist, but that he was fighting for anyway.
Sure.
And that was very powerful to people who felt oppressed, even though he wasn't really doing anything for them.
Right.
And you want to take it a step further, you got John Dillinger during the Depression, who actually went into poor neighborhoods and spent the money that he had stolen from banks, and was redistributing wealth very directly.
Yep.
And people loved him.
Sure.
And no one ever turned him in. And the only person John Dillinger ever killed was a cop he shot in self-defense coming out of a bank after the cop took a shot at him first. And I've always thought that was funny, because John Dillinger was public enemy number one at a time when Al Capone had been responsible for the St. Valentine's Day massacre just a few years earlier.
Sure.
And he only ever killed a cop who shot at him first, coming out of a bank he had robbed. So why was he public enemy number one? Because he robbed banks, and not instead of selling booze. Al Capone killed a lot of people, but hey, there was good political capital in supporting that illegal hooch.
Sure. Yeah, if I had witnessed that event and I was questioned by the police as to the appearance of the perpetrator, I would clam up.
People shouldn't talk to cops anyway. It's just bad. It's a bad habit.
I agree.
It's a bad habit to talk to cops. You talk to cops, they might take a joke about deviled eggs the wrong way. You never know.
There you go. And then what will you be?
Then exactly, where will you be?
Exactly right.
For those who don't get it, that is a steroid rage joke about the great James Toney, who had a great in the great last run of his career, kept shooting himself in the foot by testing positive for performance enhancing drugs.
Right.
And I'll expand on that joke by saying, will you believe it? Barry Bonds never killed anyone either.
That's true.
To the best of my knowledge, Mark McGuire and Jose Canseco, who are the worst offenders of the bunch.
Right. I've never bought into the roid rage phenomenon.
And I was always, I when I was a kid, obviously you can see now it's changed, but when I was a kid, I was like the one kid Dare worked on. And I believed all these terrible things they were telling us about drugs.
Yeah.
And then I grew up and I talked to people who actually use drugs, and it's like, well, wow. And then I did some research and I found out that one of the best things to ever happen to people suffering from pain was called heroin, and that the US government decided to just magically cut everybody off because of a law, and basically was torturing pain patients ever since. Because the number one reason for heroin addiction is that you get prescribed something crappy like Dilaudid for really bad pain because they're worried about you becoming addicted.
Yep.
And it's expensive and it doesn't work very well. And somebody tells you, hey, you should just try heroin. It really works. And they try heroin and one, it works better. Two, even though it's illegal, it's still cheaper than the prescription pills. And three, while the risk of addiction is real, who cares if you're not hurting?
Right. Exactly.
Which is and that last one is something that people don't think about. The tragedy of heroin is that the guy who invented it was hired to invent something less addictive than morphine. And what he invented was something that was more potent than morphine. It was actually a net gain, because what people actually needed was a better painkiller, not a less addictive painkiller. But the hunt for less addictive painkillers just made people suffer needlessly for many years. Ironically, the company that branded heroin, because heroin is the name brand, the drug is diamorphine. Heroin is the name brand. It comes from the German word heroisch, which is heroic. And a great example of the branding is that Bayer sold toothache drops with heroin in them that were designed to make your kids stop crying and be able to go play. And the pictures had of the heroin toothache drops had these rosy-cheeked kids bravely playing through their pain like they were and having a good time. And it was hugely successful branding. And they made lots of money. Heroin and aspirin, also a brand name, were the two drugs that put Bayer on the map. And then when heroin became illegal, the designer substitutes like Dilaudid were coming out, almost a new one every year, until 1966, when a drug called fentanyl was invented that put a new company called Janssen Pharmaceuticals on the map and made them huge. And now they're one of the biggest big pharma companies around because of fentanyl. And fentanyl, of course, is now almost impossible to get with a prescription unless they actually hospitalize you, despite being the most effective thing since heroin became illegal. And it just creates the same problem over and over again, where people are prescribed expensive pills that don't work, asked whether they want to try something that works better, find out it does work better, then get forced into rehab for simple possession, and then die of an OD getting out of rehab because forced rehab doesn't work. And the first thing somebody does after getting out of forced rehab is go looking for a fix. But their tolerance is down, and what used to be just right now kills them. And so forced rehab just tortures and kills drug patients for no reason. And it's just, and if I occasionally sound like a little bit of a libertarian too, that's why, even though I would not define myself that way in any sort of society needs to take care of its members basis. But I definitely have a libertarian streak in it. Well, as long as capitalism is still running things, do we really want to give the cops more power basis?
Right, right.
In which the answer is no, because police kill people.
Sure.
And that's what makes me angry these days, among others.
We all have our pet causes, and I hate to seem like I'm minimizing people's causes by calling them pet causes or any cause, calling it that. But one of mine is capital punishment.
Yes, yes.
I'll never understand. Well, I do understand the desire for capital punishment and the people who support it, what their motivations are, and because it's tremendously gratifying on an emotional and psychological level to remove a person from society who commits horrible, terrible crimes and is simply evil, right? And there are people who are born that way, who are just evil and shouldn't be members of society. And it's tremendously gratifying, again, on an emotional, psychological level, to remove those people. But because the process is run by humans who are prone to error and bias and prejudice and all manner of other things that shouldn't exist in a fix that's this permanent, mistakes will be made.
There's
people who are innocent will be killed.
The Boston legal speech by James Spader, which just goes to show how, despite everything, some of these liberal TV writers occasionally get it right, where James Spader is defending a guy who killed the guy who killed his daughter. And he's saying, I'm against capital punishment. And people say, if you're against capital punishment, how can you defend this guy? And I say, because, with capital punishment, you've got a jury and a judge and an institution. And this was a guy who knew what happened shooting the person who killed his daughter in the head personally. And that's totally different. And he made a remarkably good point. And while I don't necessarily agree with revenge killing either, a lot of what we say we're doing with capital punishment, which is intended to be so supposedly for the victim, it would be so much more honest to just let one of the family or friends of the victim take the law into their own hands than to go through this huge rigmarole in order to judicially murder someone for the victim.
Yeah, and oftentimes the victims don't even support. Not all.
This is often the case too.
Right.
There are several famous cases recently of victims' families saying, "No, don't kill him. We don't think he did it," and the state killing him anyway.
Yep.
That should not be undersold, and which goes to the point when you see these true crime shows where they put these victims' families on TV who do advocate aggressively for capital punishment. Well, who owns that media company and what's their agenda?
Sure.
And how much do they donate to the police beneficial fund in their neighborhood?
Sure.
Because that was a fascinating thing I found out during what people call the George Floyd uprising, and I think of as the great cop riots of 2020, is that Target gives massive amounts of money to the Police Beneficial Association in Minneapolis. And that PBA money gets funded back into the police department. It's not, to pay for funerals the way it used to be. It gets funded to buy military-grade equipment so the city doesn't have to.
Right.
And so Target was basically underwriting Derek Chauvin for all these years. And people then get up on their high horse. They're looting. No. They're busting up Target for a reason. It's like some of these things we think of as senseless or that the media portrays as senseless are actually very purposeful and make sense when you think them through. Like Target paid Derek Chauvin to kill George Floyd, so we're going to wreck Target.
Makes sense.
And, that's the sort of direct class warfare that the peaceful reform of the Democratic Party is supposed to prevent. They're not doing a good job of it.
Agreed.
When they were doing a good job of it, they were scared of things. They were scared of communists because of Stalin. They were scared of the civil rights movement because of communists. They were scared of Jewish people because of the civil rights movement and communists. They were scared of immigrants because of the civil rights movement and communists. I mean, the list goes on. And all these fears of communism, which led to some bad things, are also the only thing that led to the New Deal or the Great Society or any of the last few good things Richard Nixon was willing to sign, all out of fear that, we really can't have too many more poor people than the Soviet Union because it just looks bad. And they don't have that fear anymore. Now it's like, oh, look how bad things are in Russia all the time.
Or China. Yeah.
Well, I mean, but they can't quite say, look how bad things are in China the same way they used to, because the dirty secret is that when Steven Pinker trots out his little graph and says, capitalism has increased the global standard of living, the dirty little secret is, state capitalism in China by a communist government has increased the standard of living in China so much that it's increased the global standard of living.
I wanted to ask you about what you think of Steven Pinker, because I've read some of his stuff, and it's before I editorialize on it, let me know what you think of Pinker and his work.
So, liberal intellectuals are overrated. A lot of what passes for intellectualism in our society these days is actually the worst kind of anti-intellectualism and circular thought and self-justifying bullshit. And Steven Pinker is a good example of that, because he does a lot of talking outside of his actual field of scientific expertise and sounds really stupid, and people treat him like he's smart because of his completely different field of expertise somewhere else. He doesn't even have the excuse of having made lots of money the way Bill Gates does. I mean, Bill Gates is stupid too, but Bill Gates is at least a billionaire, and people have to pretend that he's smart because they need his money. Whereas Steven Pinker doesn't have that money. People like Bill Gates pretend he's smart because he benefits them. That's my thinking on Steven Pinker.
Interesting. How about Chomsky?
Chomsky is interesting. Chomsky makes me think about something Michael Parenti wrote in Black Shirts and Reds, which is they support every revolution except the successful ones. Noam Chomsky has written a lot of good stuff, but in the end, he's someone whose class interest leads him to protect the free speech rights of other professors with controversial political opinions, even if their controversial political opinion is, well, I planned Vietnam and that wasn't a bad thing. Chomsky famously defended Walt Rostow's appointment to a prestigious professorship at MIT, where Chomsky actually taught. And lots of liberals were saying Walt Rostow is responsible for the Vietnam War. MIT shouldn't be giving him this professorship. And Chomsky said, yes, they should. Nobody should figure someone's political position into their academic appointments. Which is tremendously interesting when you're saying, okay, and I understand that that's a nice ideal, but you're saying it's fine for MIT to appoint someone from the national security state to a prestigious professorship that's now going to expose people to the national security state in college. Have you ever seen Real Genius? That doesn't go well.
Interesting.
And it's understandable. He's a college professor. He doesn't want to see other college professors hurt for their political opinions because he's a college professor with unpopular political opinions.
Right.
The trouble is that Nothing Noam Chomsky has ever done to protect Walt Rostow has ever made anybody think better of Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky's politics aren't any more acceptable because he stands up for Walt Rostow. Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi are not suddenly making friends among the mainstream media again because they made nice with Republicans and decided Democrats were the real problem and not capitalism. They got abandoned by their Republican friends. My favorite screenshot someone else tweeted on Twitter is Matt Taibbi was whining to some of his friends because Elon Musk shadow banned him on Twitter for his primary platform being Substack. And Matt Taibbi, these billionaires, they're going to be populists too. I just have to be socially conservative and they'll embrace me. Apparently not. They still want you to use their platform and not the other guys.
Interesting.
And Taibbi was always a scam artist in the first place. Back in the 2000s, 2004 or 2008, I can't remember which. Taibbi did a series of interviews for Bill Maher where he spoke to people in rural Mississippi and on the welfare line in New York City. And it was the most classist, racist, anti-voter, anti-ordinary person, evil shit you could imagine. Ordinary people suck, and these are the folks we let vote, people. And then so now he talks about unifying class consciousness. Whose? You were making fun of us for cheap laughs for Bill Maher. What do you really think? I just find the contradictions of our media amusing. There used to be some consistency. But
so who are some good public intellectuals that you look up to, Chris?
That's a hard question to ask. I think maybe we shouldn't look up to anyone. I almost think sometimes maybe we shouldn't look up to anyone. And we should engage with everyone as equals. And that's your fault.
My fault.
Your fault and David Graeber's fault. Your fault because when I tried to engage with you like an equal, I ended up getting published in the Ring. And David Graeber's fault because when I tried to engage with him like an equal, he encouraged me to stand up to PhDs and Twitter threads. And yes, you know as much as they do. A degree doesn't actually mean you're smart. And so between those two influences, that's where I decided, I'm not going to look up to people. I'm going to engage with everybody as a human being with good and bad ideas. And when they have good ideas, I'm going to say, hey, man, I agree with you. And when they have bad ideas, I'm going to say, here's why I think that might be a problem. What do you think? And some people love that and some people don't.
I'm with you. So maybe I should rephrase the question rather than to say, who do you look up to? Are there any public intellectuals that you think are better than others or mostly right?
I think there are lots of people who say useful things. I greatly miss David Graeber. He passed away not too long after I got to know him on Twitter, and I never had the pleasure of having him on a podcast, which was like always my dream. And his widow is still doing great stuff. People should follow David Graeber Institute on Twitter and Blue Sky. It's worth it. They're doing lots of interesting academic stuff that breaks up a lot of things that everybody assumes to be true that never was true. Anthropology is much different than the history that we've been taught. And the history of the world has more in common with some of Karl Marx's ideas, some of the things Karl Marx said, than some of the things Adam Smith said. as far as the order in which things actually happened. One of the most interesting things is that there had been this anthropological assumption that authority came with civilization, and that when you started developing a complicated urban society, that was when hierarchy came in. But that hierarchies were actually imposed on cities by outside groups that came in and took cities over. And then the hierarchy became how the new ruling class imposed themselves on the people who had built the city in the first place. But that's not how we think of it. We think of hierarchy and then settlement, rather than settlement and then somebody comes and takes the settlement over. And now the people who have taken the settlement over need to maintain control. So now they need hierarchy. And that's not how we're taught it happened. But apparently, according to the actual anthropological record, that's how it happened. That the cities were sort of egalitarian and they got taken over by people who wanted what the cities had, and hierarchies got imposed. And I just find that fascinating. And we're not willing to think beyond hierarchy enough. We always think in these terms that reproduce these hierarchies. Even communism ultimately ended up with, people listen to who's the guy in charge. Even if it was better for people in some ways and standard of living increased, you still had the problem of, ultimately someone's in charge, and the person in charge might do bad things. Though they did a better job of holding their leaders responsible for bad things than the rest of us. I mean, we still haven't forced any former leaders to retire to the middle of nowhere the way they did Khrushchev. We could have done it with W, but we decided to re-embrace him instead. Smile about his painting. What is it with painters?
Who are these painters? That was a bad Jerry Seinfeld impression.
No, I remember. I think a lot of that Seinfeld thinking may have been a part of it, because Seinfeld and Friends are the two most narcissistic, self-obsessed shows ever, and they really became huge phenomenons in pop culture, and people thought of themselves, well, which friend am I, or which member of the Seinfeld cast am I, or that sort of thing. And I think that really did teach people to embrace their inner narcissism in a new way. I mean, even All in the Family, in the end, these people love each other, and it's about them sticking together despite everything. Which is why some people in the end took Archie Bunker as a positive stereotype instead of a negative stereotype, because in the end he loved his family. And Carroll O'Connor was always kind of annoyed that people liked Archie Bunker. He's like, that wasn't the point.
And he was more liberal than...
He was extremely liberal. He was so liberal that he wanted to put in the heat of the night on television as an everyday thing, and to show that because he really wanted the idea on television out of a personal bee in his bonnet that an old white guy and a young black guy could be friends, and he wanted that on television. And so, I mean, little things like that matter a lot, even if people are imperfect and don't live up to our ideals. And so, despite the fact that I can't agree with some of his later in life more hardcore positions on drugs, Carroll O'Connor is somebody who I would say is worth listening to in the point of his life where he was most right.
Yeah, I would agree.
And there are other people like that who are really worth listening to for that point in their life where they're the most right, even if nothing else. Ed Asner was very much someone like that. And again, he was overtaken by a more radical era, but he was somebody who was always way out ahead of the pack in his own time. Even Martin Sheen. is somebody who was getting jailed for protesting the Iraq war under W. Which I always thought was funny, the president getting jailed for protesting the president.
Indeed.
Which is where my I'm full of mirth line comes from, is the Stackhouse filibuster episode of The West Wing, where Martin Sheen says of the character Howard Stackhouse, I don't like him. He's a curmudgeon. And John Spencer says, well, so are we. And Martin Sheen looks at him and in a very highbrow Ivy League style says, you are. I happen to be full of mirth. And that's stuck with me ever since. And it's just like one of the greatest TV moments of TV dialogue ever. And that's why people like Aaron Sorkin, even though his stuff is problematic too, because of moments like that. That's why people still pay attention to Joss Whedon, even though everything he said about himself was proven to be a lie. It's like his dialogue is still funny and people can't help but laugh. The worst people sometimes produce the best art, and the worst people sometimes have the best ideas in a small moment in time before they become horrible again.
Sure.
That's
why we separate the art from the artist.
And some people can have magical turnabouts where they really become better people than they were. It doesn't happen very often, but it sometimes does. A story that will always be with me, and it always boggles my mind a little bit, because I know exactly what he did when he was governor of Arkansas. But the only white Democrat who endorsed Jesse Jackson for president in both 1984 and 1988 was Orville Faubus. Now, for people who don't remember the name Orville Faubus is most famous under Ike for saying, you will never integrate Little Rock Central High School, and fighting hard for white supremacy and segregation. And yet in 1984 and 1988, he's the only white Democrat endorsing Jesse Jackson for president.
How did that happen?
I have no fucking clue. I have to swear when I say it. I have no fucking clue how that happened. But something happened.
Yeah. And
what it came down to was in the end, the way that he put it, and who knows, because it's politicians. Maybe he just thought it was time for him to change and have a face turn, because you never know what's real and what's fake with politicians. But in his own words, he said, in the end, I realized that the poor white guy and the poor black guy both have the same problem, and it's the rich white guy.
Amen.
And I mean, a lot of stuff is really that simple. And that's why people like John Dillinger. It's why people liked Railroad Bill. Even though they were actually neo-Confederate terrorists who didn't like black people, it was why people liked Jesse James. They were stealing from the rich. There's a line in I can't remember this movie, but the criminal says, I never robbed no citizen, stole a man's watch. I robbed banks and trains. And there's a lot of thinking. I mean, yeah, I never got mugged. Nobody ever got mugged by John Dillinger. There were only 2 occasions in his entire career where Jesse James robbed passengers. And in both cases, because the money box was empty and they didn't have any other way to pay people. So they're like, we're really sorry about this. Normally we wouldn't do this. And they were apologizing to people as they took their wallets. It just, and that was the sort of thing that mattered to people. They didn't care what Jesse James' actual horrible politics were. They cared that he robbed the bank and mostly didn't rob them. And so when they talk about how the The guy Luigi had maybe some corporate state ideas. He was a billionaire fanboy, blah, blah, blah. It's like, sure. But, his back really hurt. And they gave him a spinal fusion instead of the surgery he really needed. And then they told him they wouldn't give him the surgery he really needed until he was 40 because he was too young to have that surgery. And it's like, so he understood what the health system does to people. And in the end, that's what he was acting on, not whatever politics he was tweeting about 6 months before that. And people understand that. And people who really understand that don't necessarily care what he was tweeting about 6 months before. They care about what happened. And they realize that someone did something. An anarchist named Alexander Berkman called that the propaganda of the deed and went to prison for a half-assed attempt to shoot a railroad millionaire. Luigi didn't screw it up the same way. People heard it. People heard what he was saying by what he did. And people sympathized with what he was saying by what he did. And you can like it or dislike it, but in an era where Democrats aren't doing anything to help anyone and Republicans are actively trying to hurt people, that's the sort of thing that makes folk heroes.
Yep, absolutely right. I agree.
And I think we're going to have more folk heroes as time goes on because we're coming into an era where we're going to need folk heroes the way that folk heroes always come out of these hard times.
That makes sense.
I mean, if you think about it, you look at the actual first Robin Hood mention in an old play called Piers Plowman, which takes place early in the reign of William the Conqueror after the Normans have just taken over. So in the very first Robin Hood story, the king is a foreign invader, and Robin Hood is not just fighting for the poor man, robbing from the rich and giving to the poor, but he's also standing up for his people against an invader. And you see that in the movie, even though they changed some of the characters around. But that if he had stolen from other poor people, nobody would know who Robin Hood was.
Right.
And if you actually read the stories, Robin Hood wasn't political. The giving to the poor were nice things Robin Hood did for specific people because he had a good heart, not any sort of political program. But what resonated was stole from the rich, give to the poor, and that's what people remembered.
Right.
And every folk outlaw since is some variation of a Robin Hood story. And before, there are variations on Robin Hood before Robin Hood even. Spartacus
so there were Robin Hoods before figure. Robin Hood.
Spartacus is a Robin Hood figure.
Huh.
Of course, the modern thinking of Spartacus is post-Robin Hood, I suppose. And Howard Fast, who wrote the Spartacus novel that became the Kirk Douglas movie, was like Kirk Douglas, a Jewish communist under an assumed name. So the modern view of Spartacus may have more to do with Robin Hood than I would like to think, but Spartacus did what he did before Robin Hood.
Right. Interesting.
It was just, and again, he wasn't the last one either. There's a figure, Dracula is a Robin Hood figure from the point of view of the Transylvanians of the Turkish occupation. Even though he was really a tool of the Turks, because of the circumstances of his death, he is remembered as a folk hero. Because he died fighting the Turks, even though he was their tool most of his life. And I guess dying fighting the Turks matters. Well, like El Cid in Spain. El Cid spent most of his career working for one of the Muslim barons as opposed to the Christian barons. but he's remembered for a battle that was fought after he was already dead, where they put him on the horse. John Brown's a good example. John Brown just was a complete screw up, but his completely screwing up led to better consequences than many people's success in the end. People were actually inspired by John Brown to do the things they did during the Civil War. There was a John Brown regiment in Kansas. The colonel of Jennison's Jayhawkers, which was another Kansas regiment, was an abolitionist who moved in the same circles as the people who funded John Brown. He had a tremendous influence on people who were important in the Civil War on a micro level, especially in Kansas and West Virginia and East Tennessee and other places where there were people who wanted to fight against slavery and secession because they thought slavery was wrong. Something that gets forgotten is that all the poorest places in the American South are either black or where the white people who sided with the black people during the Civil War lived. Like West Virginia, which is the poorest state in the country, seceded from Virginia, which was the richest state in the country, because they didn't want to fight a war against the federal government over slavery. They would rather abolish slavery and stay with the federal government. And now West Virginia is the poorest state in the country. East Tennessee was the home of Orville Browning, who famously said, "I shall fight the secessionist devils until hell freezes over. And then I propose to fight them on the ice." And the first thing they did after Tennessee seceded was they sent a troop of Confederate soldiers to arrest him at his newspaper. And East Tennessee is in horrible poverty. During the Civil War, at the Battle of Blountville was a pro-Union town in East Tennessee. The Union Army was there to try to help them. The Confederate Army, while shooting at the Union Army, deliberately bombarded the pro-Union town. It's just these wonderful little pieces of history that folks don't know these days, because rich white people really love the neo-Confederate stuff because it allows them, if slavery was okay, then what they're doing, it must be okay too.
Right.
If the past is justified, then what I'm doing now is justified.
Okay. How was John Brown a screw up?
Well, Harper's Ferry was not something that was going to succeed in the way he meant it to succeed.
Right.
And the very first person who was killed at Harper's Ferry was the Black Night Watchman, who was on duty at the arsenal, and he was shot by the people who wanted to free the slaves. So there's an irony in that. But at the same time, it was the Harper's Ferry failure that had people singing John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave. And Ralph Waldo Emerson, I mean, imagine a public intellectual today saying something like this about anyone who broke the law the way John Brown did. Ralph Waldo Emerson publicly declared John Brown a saint and a martyr.
Yes.
Malcolm X said, "Hey, if you want to know about white people, ask them what they think of John Brown."
There you go.
And I think that's something to remember these days when people want to talk about, well, the healthcare executive had a family too. The 68,000 people who die every year because they're denied have families.
Yep.
My diabetic wife, who can't stay managed because the rules for paying for a glucose monitoring system that's the only thing that lets her stay on top of her sugar change every year. And the longest she's ever been able to stay on a glucose monitoring system is like half a year. You're supposed to be able to do it all the time, right? It's just ridiculous. And don't get me started on insulin profiteering. That's its own show.
And we're just about out of time, right? It looks like.
I mean, that's really the sort of thing where if you are running out of time, then an hour to 90 minutes is always a good time to wrap. I'm the sort of person I can keep going for as long as someone else keeps going, and that's both good and bad.
Right. But I am out of time.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. It's a Sunday morning. People have other things to do. I really appreciate you joining me. Thank you.
My pleasure, Chris.
And I will probably bug you again sometime. And I thank you in advance for a polite refusal if that's what happens. But jokes aside, no, it's been a pleasure. Thanks very much. Have a great Sunday.
Thank you. You do too.
You have anything you want to plug before you go?
I'm good. Thanks.
And everybody else, I do check out your pinned tweet is still your Matthew Saad Muhammad book.
Yes.
Do check out his pinned tweet on Twitter at William Dettloff. His book is worth reading. The Ezra Charles book is great, but I've always been partial to Ezra Charles, so that's just me. Thank you very much again. Everybody take care. And yes, actually, that's a good idea for the future. I should do that. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you again, Bill. Thanks, everyone. And until next week, I'll tweet at you.
Thanks, Chris.
Oh, my pleasure.